Hi, I'm Kate Fuller. I'm an extension specialist in the Department of Ag Economics and Economics here at MSU, and I am going to be talking about pasture leases today. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is also applicable to other types of leases like cropland and crop share leases, but the focus is going to be on pasture. So, just to give an overview of what I'm going to go over today, we're going to talk about finding and assessing land, what to include in a lease, different types of leases, some of which you might not have heard of before, lease rates, where you can go for information and tools you can use as part of the negotiation process, and more information. So first off, finding land. Land access is really important to getting into farming, obviously. A lot of young and beginning farmers don't inherit land these days. And there have been a couple of studies looking at getting people into farming, so is a concern. And land access is the most significant barrier to entry into farming. So how can you get land if you're looking for a lease or if you're looking for tenants? There are a couple nice resources here in Montana. The Hay Hotline, which is maybe not a place that you'd think to look for land, is a really nice resource for both hay and if you are looking to lease out your pasture or if you're looking for some pasture to lease. The address for this website is at the bottom of this slide. We also have it on our website, which I'll go over at the end of this presentation. But the address for our website is msuextension.org/aglease, just in case you don't make it to the end. So here you can see you can find hay listings for sale or wanted and pasture listings available or wanted, and it's by region of the state. There's usually a few things up there. It varies a lot over the course of the year, so if you don't find something now, maybe put a want ad up and see what you get and check back. Another really nice resource, particularly if you're just getting into farming, is FarmLink Montana. And this is just a picture of this map feature that they offer, and you can put up again a want ad or a listing for land in different parts of the state. You can see there are some in other states as well. Idaho has a couple listings. This is from a couple months ago, so you might want to check if you don't see anything in your area right now. But you can also find farming mentors. So someone that is maybe getting out of farming but is looking to rent out their land and maybe mentor someone else who's looking to get in. So it's a neat resource, and again, we have a link to this on our website, or you can just Google FarmLink Montana. This is their land link website. So there are a number of other ways you can find land, obviously. There's community listservs. I don't know of too many towns around here that have these, but I know my town back home has one, and I check it every day, and it's just a way for people to let people know what's going on in town. Sometimes you see land listings there as well, or people that are looking for a little bit of land. Bulletin boards around town, sometimes I see land listed there. It's always a good idea to talk to your neighbors and your family members. They may be aware of some things that you're not, or maybe someone has a little piece of land you can get access to. A local realtor can sometimes be a good resource. I know in some areas of the state, people are more tuned into this than others. You can also place a want ad, maybe in your local paper or on Craigslist. Those are just a couple ideas. You probably know of other ways you can find land. So next I'm going to talk about what to include in a lease once you've found that piece of land. So what makes a good lease? So the very basic sort of components is that you really want to lay out who is responsible for what and when those things are going to happen. You want basic detail on the people involved and the property itself, so the official property name, people's full names. You want to clearly state the duration of the lease, how it's going to get renewed, and the rate or how it'll be calculated. So I'll talk about some different ways that you can calculate a lease rate. And so if you are using a variable rate lease, so one that changes from year to year based on prices or production, you really want to lay out how that calculation is going to happen. Now, if you use a form or sample lease, which is something that you can find online, and I'll show you a couple sources where you can find those, you might need to add to it. So some of them will have blank lines that you can fill in. You can also cross stuff out and write in things that you feel are more appropriate. So I'm going to go into detail on those four important things to include in the lease. But before I get started, one way that's pretty common in defining how a pasture lease is set up is by animal unit. And there are a lot of different ways on how that can be defined. So I always like to ask people, what is an animal unit, or what do you think of as an animal unit? So I'll show you a couple different versions. This is something from Iowa State Extension, and here they've got a mature cow as being somewhere between 1 and 1.4 animal unit months. A bull is at 1.5. A yearling is between 0.7 and 0.9. You get the picture. So there are these large ranges. Here we've got another publication. And this is saying that a cow that's dry or a cow with calf are 1 animal unit. A bull is 1.25. So we've got some different definitions here. Here's another one that is defining that entirely on the animal's weight. So the gist of this is that there are a number of different ways that this can be defined. So if you're using this to define how your rate is calculated, it's a good idea to put your definition into the lease. And you can add an addendum that's one of these tables that I just showed you, or just write out exactly what you mean by animal unit or animal unit month. So once you've decided what to include, a couple points to consider. It's always a good idea to have a written lease. Sometimes this is a little bit of a hard sell for different people, but I'll give you a couple reasons why I like to tell people that it's a good idea to write this stuff down. So one of them is that different states have different lease laws. So here in Montana, our lease law says that, our statute of frauds says that if you have a lease that is more than 1 year in duration, it has to be written for it to be enforceable. What that ends up meaning in court, or what it has ended up meaning in court, is that it's a lot harder to enforce a multi-year lease if you don't have it written down. Now, these other reasons, so you want to make sure that terms are understood and agreed upon by both parties. You can file it at the county clerk and recorder's office. These are things that you can really only do if you have a written lease. So that's not to say there's no way you can understand and agree upon an unwritten lease. But if you have something that's written down, you have something that you can refer to when things come up. It's a good idea to talk to your lawyer, maybe your accountant. They too are going to tell you that it's a good idea to write it down, and they might have some insight as to clauses and phrasing that's important. If you file it at your county clerk and recorder's office, that is just another layer kind of in the process. So you'll have a third party that notarizes the lease. So if something comes up, you have that on record as well. So that's not a bad idea also. So okay, so back to thinking through who's responsible for what. So a couple of major things: management practices. So who's going to check on animals? Who's going to set grazing management plan? Monitoring. So there's often a clause that the landlord has a right to enter and inspect. If you're a landlord, you probably want to make sure you have this opportunity. If you are a tenant, you're going to want to know about it. Often there's a statement about how much notice will be given by the landlord before they come on the property. Infrastructure and improvements. So if you have animals on a piece of property, you are probably going to want to know that they have access to good, consistent water. So who's going to be in charge of monitoring that and testing it, as well as other improvements that are important, such as fencing, corrals, who's going to place salt blocks, things like that. Compensation for long-term improvements. So if the tenant puts up a fence, how does the landlord or the next tenant compensate them if that lease turns over? Government programs and disaster assistance. So this is more of a crop issue, but for ARC and PLC, which are programs under the current Farm Bill, tenants needed to have power of attorney, so you want to make sure that you can set that up. So they needed that in order to make the decision for those government programs. So that can be really important. EQIP and CRP are important as well. There was this case, I think it was a while back, Eagle Watch versus Smith, in which the tenant and the landlord decided to enter into CRP. The landlord thought that the CRP payment would be in addition to the lease payment, and the tenant thought that the CRP payment would be instead of the lease payment. And that was in court for a long time. So laying that out from the get-go is a very good idea. I should say we have another recording on our website, which is by Terry Shaplow. He's an ag lawyer. He teaches classes in our department, and he has a lot of experience with setting up leases and knows a lot about the history of when some of this stuff has gone to court. He talks about this case in particular in his webinar. So, continuing on this, who is responsible for what? hunting access and or revenue. So who determines whether there is hunting access, who can come on, who's going to collect revenue from people that are paying a fee to do that. Mineral rights and extraction. This is an issue that's more of an issue in certain areas of the state than others. So if there are mineral rights or wind power on the property, granting access for people to come on and maintain those facilities is something that's important for a tenant to know about. Risk management, so livestock and liability insurance. Liability insurance is always important, but particularly so if you have people that are coming on the property for recreation, especially hunting. So you can talk to your insurance agent to make sure that you're covered. If you're entering into a more share-based lease arrangement, you can maybe talk about some other price risk management strategies as well and set them up in the lease. One way to go through, I know there's sort of a lot here that you can think about when you're thinking about who is responsible for all the stuff that goes on in an operation, is sort of a checklist. And some of the sample leases will have these and some of them won't. But just kind of Googling around and seeing what kinds of things people have included in their leases will give you an idea of what you might want to include in yours. So this is just a subset of all the things that you might want to include. So then you can mark off who is responsible for each one of these items. So what about the unexpected? So up to now we've kind of been laying out, day to day in the sort of what you might think of as an average year. Who is responsible for what things in the lease. But what about if you run into a situation like this? This photo is from Phillips County a few years ago, and we had some massive flooding. People lost a lot of hay, and some pasture areas. Animals had to be taken off early. We've seen a number of natural disasters in recent years. So this is a flood map from a few months ago, or sorry, a drought map from a few months ago, where you can see pretty bad drought in the northwest part of the state. We've seen flooding. I just showed you a picture of that. Seen a lot of fire in recent years. But other things like late payments and the death of a landowner or tenant, those are things you're going to want to cover as well. And this is yet another reason to put that lease in writing. So day-to-day expected circumstances, you can have a better understanding of the expectations by both parties if it's all written out. It's nice to have for tax purposes and also some FSA programs. I think there's a form that you can fill out to get around a written lease, but just being able to hand over a copy of your lease is a lot easier. And then in these unexpected circumstances, this will serve as a legally enforceable reminder of the terms that you have agreed on. One thing that I've thought about in the last couple of years is adding a disaster clause. So I know this is something that some folks from Extension in the Midwest have been talking about for a while, but in these last couple of years where we've had a lot of stuff come up where animals need to be taken off or grazing pressure needs to be reduced in ways that are not easily anticipated. You can add a clause to the lease to to state how grazing will be affected if any of these things come up. So if your drought is getting bad, who will make the decision and how much notice will be given as to whether animals will be taken off or numbers will be reduced. All right, so next I'm going to talk about different types of leases that you can set up. So there's two sort of major types of leases. You can have a fixed lease, fixed cash lease, or you can have a variable rate lease. So the first big bullet point here is this fixed cash lease. It stays the same from year to year. It's on a per acre, per head, per cow-calf pair, or per AUM basis. The vast majority of leases, particularly pasture leases in Montana, are fixed cash. And that's generally true around the country as well. Share and flexible rate leases fall into the variable category. So in these types, your rate is going to vary from year to year based on price or production risk. In a share lease, the tenant is going to pay the landlord by the production volume or their revenue. And this is a case where the landlord is sharing in price or production risk. A flexible lease is similar, except that you have a fixed base rate that you set up and you adjust it to reflect the current condition relative to some kind of historical average or index. This is another case in which the landlord is sharing in the price or production risk. So I'll talk about each of these types of leases. So as an economist, I always like to think about trade-offs or costs and benefits. So I'll go through some of the costs and benefits of each of these types of leases. For fixed cash leases, the advantages or the benefits of this type of lease is that they are very simple. They stay the same from year to year for the duration of the lease. They're really common, which is a benefit if you're looking to set your rate. You can probably talk to some people with similar land in a location near you and get an idea for what you might want to charge or what the going rate is. They're predictable. So like I said, they generally stay the same from year to year. There's less decision making for landowners, so that can be a big benefit, particularly if someone is wanting to get out of farming and hand things on to the next generation or to someone else. But there are disadvantages or costs to this type of lease as well. So landowners don't get to participate in any of the good year windfall profits. So this was more of an issue a couple of years ago than it is right now, but we saw some very, very good cattle prices, and landowners that had a fixed rate, particularly for a long duration of time, would not have gotten to share in any of those large benefits. There's also some evidence that that fixed cash leases have a lower payment compared to share leases. So tenants are a little bit more willing to pay a little bit more to have someone to share in some of the risk that they are experiencing. And for the tenant, along those same lines, they have all the yield and price risk. So that can be a disadvantage as well. So flexible arrangements, so those are the bottom two from the list I showed you before. So share and flexible leases, as well as a number of different kind of hybrids that you can make up. They fall into this flexible arrangement category. So advantages for these type of leases is that get reduced production or price risk for the tenant because they have someone to share in at least one of those risk areas. Both parties see the benefits in a good year. So if you were a landlord in say 2014 or early 2015 when those cattle prices were so great, you would get to see a bump in your lease payment. There's also more communication. So if you are a tenant that's just getting into farming, this may be advantageous to you. You have potentially someone who's looking to get out but has a lot of knowledge in the business, and if you have a share or flexible lease with them, they have a vested interest in seeing you do well. So it's a good incentive for them to impart some of their knowledge to you. There are some disadvantages as well. So for the landowner, the income is going to become variable, just like it sounds. So if you need a very fixed income, this may not be the way to go. There's also self-employment tax considerations. So back when I showed the list of those 3 different types of leases, and I said that the bottom 2, or the variable rate leases, the landlord shares in the price or production risk. Well, those are ways that the landlord can be considered an active participant in the operation, which can leave you open to self-employment taxes. So it's a good idea to talk to your accountant about that. There's also going to need to be more measurement, record keeping, or maybe trust between the 2 parties. So if your landlord has a stake in the operation, they're probably going to want to know something about what you as the tenant are doing. So what that means can be a lot of different things, but it can be a bit of a paperwork or measurement burden. And along those same lines, there's going to need to be more communication. So if you have someone that is great to talk to, this can be a benefit. But if you have someone that is a little more difficult, this can be a definite negative. All right, so next I'm going to go through examples of what these types of variable rate leases mean. So first we're going to look at a share example. So this is kind of one of the simplest ways that you can set this up. And again, these aren't exhaustive. These are really meant to be examples to kind of get you thinking about ways you might set up one of these variable rate leases. So in a share of gain example, the landowner is going to charge per pound of weight gained by calves over the season or over the time that they're on the pasture. So in this example, I'm just going to say that the calves are they're entering the pasture at 150 pounds, they're coming off at 500, and the price per pound gained is 50 cents. So this is just a pretty simple example with numbers that are relatively easy. So while they're on that pasture, they gain 350 pounds. So we just look at 350 pounds times that 50 cents per pound. So we've got 175 per calf, and that's the amount that the tenant will pay the landlord. Now, getting just a little more complicated, we can set up a lease that is based on the share of the value of gain. So in this example, we're going to calculate the change in value of calves while they're on that pasture. So I'm going to kind of wave my hands here and say that we calculate the contributions of the landowner and the tenant. So they're going to put together a kind of budget over the course of the year for what they're doing to the land, what things they're paying for. And then they're going to divide the proceeds according to that contribution. And I'll show you some places if you're interested in putting together one of these contribution spreadsheets is really what they end up being. I'll show you a place where you can find those towards the end. Now, this approach requires a bit more work, which you can probably guess by the fact that I'm saying I'm just waving my hands for the calculations portion of it. But once we have that figured out, or once we have the contributions figured out, the rest is pretty simple. So here, again, I've got the calves are starting on the pasture at 150 pounds. And I'm going to say their value at that point is 175 a hundredweight, or 262 per calf. When they come off, when these calves come off, they're a little heavier than the calves in the other example. They're 550 pounds, and they are worth 150 a pound, so 825 per calf. So the value of that gain is $563, just the difference of their value when they hit the pasture versus the value when they came off. And now we're going to divide that up equitably. So what that equitably means is by those contributions that we already figured out. So the landowner is going to tally their costs. That's going to come to $80 per calf. And the livestock owner tallies their costs, and that comes to $120 per calf. So the landowner's portion of the costs is 40%. The livestock owner's is 60%. The total operating cost is $200 a calf. So then we divide that 563 by those portions. So 40% of 563 is $225 a calf. That's what the tenant is going to pay the landlord in this example. And the livestock owner keeps the rest. Now, another way that we can set this up is by flexing on price. And in general, this is going to provide a little bit more of a constant supply of, or constant lease rate for the landlord, although that's going to depend on how you set this up. So we're going to have a base rate that's fixed for the term of the lease, and then we're going to adjust it, in this case based on current prices relative to historical prices, although you could do this based on production as well. So in this first example, I'm going to say we're going to set a base rate of $5 an acre. This is another simplified version, so don't take any of these numbers as what you should be using. We're going to take the 10-year average steer calf price of $150 per pound, and we're going to compare it to the October futures contract price in the year that we're looking at. So I'm going to say that 10-year average is $150 per pound. That's actually pretty close to what it is. And I'm going to say the October futures contract is $120 per pound. So then we end up with this indexed rate. So we get that, we have that $5 an acre base rate, and we multiply it by this index, which is going to be the October futures contract, or that 120, over the 10-year average, or the long-term average of 150, and we end up with $4 an acre. So this this year in this example is a worse year, so the tenant gets a little bit of a break on their price. But this can turn out very differently. So this is a very similar example where I've just tweaked a couple things. We have the same base rate and the same 10-year average price. But I'm looking at 2014, and I'm looking at what the futures contract was in the spring of that year for October. It was about $2.20 a pound. So the indexed rate is going to be $5 multiplied by 220 over 150, and that comes to $7.33 an acre. So the tenant would share in some of that good year with their landlord. All right, so that goes over a couple different types of leases. And next I'm going to talk about lease rates. So where you can go for information and tools that you can use in the negotiation process. So I mentioned this before, but this is our MSU Extension Ag Leasing website, and it's a great source for a variety of different information, as well as resources, so links to other sites that are useful. So here's what it looks like when you sign on. We've got lease rates, which is what I'm going to go over first. They're right up top here. Resources to other websites as well, and I'll go through what exactly some of these are in a moment here. We've got a mock guide list, so there's a mock guide on creating beef cattle share leases, grazing leases, a Big Sky Small Acres article by Jeff Mosley talking about pasture leases, a couple other things. Here's that leasing webinar from Terry Shaplow, the ag lawyer that I spoke about earlier. So a lot of good information in one spot. So first I'm going to show you our cash lease rate page by county. So you click on that and you can choose what county you want to look at. So looks like Gallatin, which is where I'm at, is already selected, but you can see you can choose any of the other counties for which we have information. I've chosen Gallatin here. And then we can look at pasture, irrigated cropland, and non-irrigated cropland for looking back to 2009. Now these are not information that we collect. This is actually from USDA, National Statistics Service website, and they are, here's a little disclaimer about this information back down here, but these rates are per acre per year, but they don't specify lease term. So these could be for a couple months or for the entire season or for the entire year. So a lot of different things are lumped together. You can choose which of these rates you want to graph and look at them over time. So I've got pasture graphed here. Looks like for 2016 we're at about $12.50 an acre in Gallatin County. So that's the county cash lease rate page. Another useful resource is this Montana average grazing rates. So we have these going back quite a while. And this is a statewide average, but it's given in a different metric. So these are per animal unit, per cow-calf pair, or per head. We don't have the 2016 rates yet. These again are from NASS, and I don't think that they'll put the 2016 rate out until sometime in the spring. But you can see that for the state, we're at about $23 per AU or per head, and 26 for cow-calf pair. All right, I think that's all I'm going to talk about on that page for now. Okay. So if you saw any of those averages and you were skeptical, that didn't really seem like it reflected the rates that you're seeing or what you think is reasonable, that's probably a valid concern. So there are a number of different things that affect these averages. So one is time. So these are a combination of leases that were just set up last year and leases that were set up maybe 10 or 15 years ago and haven't been updated. Especially when looking at leases across the state of Montana, we see a huge variety of productivity. And we see some of that even within some of our counties. So quality and quantity of forage vary drastically. There's also not any control for improvements. So fencing, corrals, water, some of that stuff is in some of these leases or on some of these tracts of land, and on others it's not. So that variation enters into it as well. Location, so if you're near a major urban area, or maybe you're closer to a grain elevator, you can see a bit of a premium on that land. There's also the opportunity cost of development pressure. So if you're near a urban center, like here in Bozeman, you might see a little bit have a higher rate because there is the alternative of developing a property into housing. There's also a number of non-market values or values that are harder to capture, but some of those include a good tenant relationship. So there's some evidence that really long-term leases with someone that you have a really nice relationship with and takes good care of the land, some of those lease rates are going to be a little lower because you're willing to pay as a landlord a little bit of or you're willing to accept a little bit of a lower lease rate in return for some of the value you're getting from that person taking care of the land and letting you know what's going on. There's also people that want to keep the land in family, so maybe they cut their son or daughter a little bit of a break on the price. All right, so next we're going to go through some places you can find more information. And a lot of these are going to be, on our website that I just showed you. So some of these are, or all of these are external websites. So this is just one example. The NRCS puts together these soil maps, which can be really helpful in determining a stocking rate and subsequently what you might want to charge or pay for a particular tract of land. And what you can do within this thing that I've got circled here, the Soil Data Explorer, is select your tract of land, and then and it gets pretty detailed. And then it will show you in a favorable, normal, and unfavorable year how much production that piece of property is predicted to have. So this is an example of somewhere in Fallon County. It gives you an idea of what type of soil and what type of slope is on this particular tract, and then what the forage production on each of those soil types is predicted to be in a given year. And what a lot of people do is take an unfavorable year and use that as the basis for setting their stocking rate. Another really nice resource that I like a lot. It's only for cropland at this point, but this is Fair Rent, which is a tool put together by Extension in the Midwest, and what it basically does is lead you through a series of steps, kind of filling out a spreadsheet, except with a little more guidance on calculating an equitable rate. So it's that contributions approach that I talked about earlier. So the landlord can enter their values of expenditures, and the tenant can do the same, and then it helps to calculate a share rate as well as a fixed cash rate that will, for a landlord, cover their costs, and for a tenant, gives an idea of kind of the maximum that you would be willing to pay so that you get more out of the lease than you're putting in, essentially. So these are a good starting point for negotiations. It'll give you a kind of range of areas where both parties can do well with the lease. Ag Lease 101 is a great resource. A lot of the stuff that you will be interested in is in the document library up here. They have a number of guides on setting up different types of leases. They also have sample leases, so it's a nice place to look for some of those terms and conditions, those lists of what each party is agreeing to do over the course of the lease. Those are in their sample leases. They've got a couple of presentations as well, but it's a really nice resource. It's very Midwest focused, so you'll see examples that maybe look a little different than production systems you might see here in Montana, but it is a really nice place to look. Lastly, just another plug for our website. You can find all the tools I just mentioned on there. So those NAS rates I showed you for the county and for the state, links to Ag Lease 101, Fair Rent, Land Link, that land listing website that I showed early in the presentation, the Monk Guides I talked about, Ag Leasing Law webinar by Terry Shaplow, and then links to those soil surveys as well. Lastly, if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me here. Given my email address, which is kate.fuller@montana.edu, and you can also try to find me in the office. So my number is here as well. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and good luck.